Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep phones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Dain Donelson. Dain Donelson is one of the top accounting thought leaders in the world. He is a professor of accounting at the University of Wisconsin. His research involves litigations, fraud, earning management, corporate law, corporate governance, and accounting standards. He holds a Ph.D. in accounting from the University of Illinois. His research has been published in top-ranking journals, including Journal of Accounting and Economics, Review of Accounting Studies, Contemporary Accounting Research, and Accounting Organization and Society, Journal of Accounting Research, and the Accounting Review. Now we will start our seminar with the Professor Dain Donelson.
Okay, thanks for the invitation, Mohamed, and welcome everyone. So this paper is about disclosure management, evidence from regulatory threshold avoidance. If anyone has questions as we go, please just jump in. I'd rather have a discussion than, save questions for the end or just have me lecture. So this paper is also co-authored with, I should say, Christian Hutzler, former PhD student of mine who's now at the University of Texas, Brian Monson, who's also here, who's at Ohio State, and who's also a former PhD student of mine, and Christopher Yost, Texas A&M, who you may see a theme here, another former PhD student of mine. So it's a hat trick, I guess, there. So I'd usually start with the research question, but I'm going to just do a really brief background on the study setting, and because it's a little bit unusual. So we're not claiming we're the first people who've ever looked at, disclosure management, but we think this setting is kind of nice. Most studies who've looked at, disclosure management look more at things like timing or tone of language, things like that. And what we have here is a setting where the SEC amended a regulation that deals with risk factor disclosures in the 10K. So item 5 in regulation SK deals with the risk factor disclosures, and it requires firms to summarize their risk factors only when those disclosures exceed 15 pages. And so this went into effect for 10Ks filed after November 9th, 2020, and it put in place this summary requirement, and the summary is limited to 2 pages. So on its face, that doesn't seem particularly onerous, but there was actually, as often happens when there's any new disclosure requirement, a fair amount of debate in, legal blogs and commentary to the SEC leading up to this. So the main debate dealt with some, sort of legal uncertainty regarding what we're calling legal risk as opposed to just purely litigation risk, because it goes a little broader than securities litigation and SEC enforcement to capture also things like comment letters and some lower level legal uncertainty. So one side sort of said, this risk factor summary, trying to condense, what some firms now have 20, 30, 40 pages and more sometimes, is going to mislead investors. They're going to focus only on this summary, that we're forced to provide, and they're not going to read the full risk factor section. Other people said it's going to improve, the investor summary, more information is better. And those were sort of the two sides. The SEC, came down on the side of more disclosure is better, and they decided to require this summary. But for a lot of firms, this was optional, right? If you're around this 15 pages, you could avoid things. And so that leads to our research questions. So what are the effects on these pre-existing disclosures from this legal uncertainty associated with a new disclosure regulation? Or in other words, do firms manage their disclosure? And then if firms manage their disclosure, what type of firms do that? How do they do it? And what are the potential consequences of that? And so just we'll go to sort of the most important findings here. And so, we kind of have on the left side here, it's not quite a normal distribution. It's, pretty skewed with a long right tail. But we've got item 1A, which is the risk factor disclosure section before this regulation went into effect. And you don't see anything really unusual there, right? It looks like a pretty standard, distribution. Some firms, look like they might get a little carried away, but maybe those are their real risks, right? So we've got a couple firms out in the 50-page range, but it pretty much tails off at, 30 to 40 pages. As we move to the right side, you see a real change, right? We have some peaks at about 14 pages. It really drops off at 15, right? So we've got the highest peak at 13, another slightly shorter peak at 14, and we've got a real trough at 15 pages, and then it's, really much, much lower than, what we see on the left-hand side. So as you can tell from the colors here, for those of you who are familiar with Big Ten football, Brian from Ohio State did these graphs. They're gray and red. So we've got a large Buckeye influence. And so as we overlay these, we can just really see the distribution on the next page. We've got, the modernization here. So, the red graph peaking much higher in the post period, and, just, a very dramatic shift where firms just did not want to provide this summary. They really, felt strongly about that this was gonna apparently, based on the commentary before the regulation went into effect, expose them to some type of legal risk, right? This was what people talked about, and, what they seemed to think was the danger in providing the summary. Now, did this change as the summary was out there? So we did, 3 years just to see what happened. And you can see, not a lot changed. So 1, 2, and 3 years out, we still see the trough. Looks very similar as we move forward. So year 1 is the highest. Year 2 is the next highest. Year 3 drops down a little bit, but it still looks very similar, right? So firms didn't see this as a bad strategy, and they kept doing this management of their disclosures. And like I said, I don't think we're the first people to look at managing disclosures, but the nice thing about this is, it's a very clear test. It's got this bright line threshold, and, we can't identify each particular firm, but we can identify strongly that there's a group of firms who thinks that this is a danger to them and wants to not be providing this summary. So, moving forward, again, we've got this overlay. We can see, just that there's this huge drop off after the 15 pages. Okay. So again, we can't identify individual firms, but we can identify groups of firms. who this result is more concentrated in. So who is that? It's kind of where you'd expect firms with more what we call legal focus. And so if you got a general comment letter from the SEC, so what we're calling general comment letters is anything except your risk factor disclosures. So if you got a comment on your risk factor disclosures, meaning the SEC, scrutinized those in the year or two before this regulation went into effect, then you don't cut your risk factor disclosures. So if they're directly scrutinizing you, you leave your risk factors alone. But if you had, general scrutiny, then you do cut it, right? So you want to sort of stay out of trouble, and you cut it there. If you have a powerful general counsel, which we just followed the prior literature there, a general counsel in the top 5 most highly compensated executives. So they probably have more of an influence, more legal influence on your disclosure policy, the more powerful the general counsel is. And so, excuse me, we use those two things to sort of to identify more legal focus within the firm. So those are firms, that's how we test for, legal focus in firms. Are the cuts real or are they cosmetic? So, the SEC didn't say how you had to get under 15 pages. So for anyone who's looked at, the US 10K, I know not everyone is from the US. There's, lots of bullet points and spacing in the risk factor disclosures. One way to get there is just to, put things in paragraphs as opposed to bullet points. You can do lots of cosmetic things. For the most part, firms did things in a substantive manner. And so they cut out words and sentences and risk factors. So we'll see that on average, they cut out about 5 risk factors themselves. So they didn't just cut cosmetics. Now, there are some cosmetic cuts. Some firms, push the spacing down and things like that. But overall, the cuts were substantive. So it appears that, some of the concerns that maybe risk factor disclosures were just growing with boilerplate and were maybe becoming less useful were valid. So that's been expressed by a lot of people over the years, that firms were just copying other people in the industry, and risk factors ideally should be tailored to a specific firm. Our results provide, I think, some validity to those concerns. Another thing that the SEC said that they wanted was improved readability from this. There was not a lot of impact on that. So the only place that we saw some improved readability was for the firms that were in the 15 to 17 page mark before the regulation and then cut their disclosures. So we're pretty confident that's not what the SEC meant, that their target in this was to actually get summaries from firms, not that they created this regulation intending for firms to cut their summary or cut their disclosures and improve readability that way. Nevertheless, we thought we should acknowledge that in this very limited sample, they did get improved readability. And then one of the more interesting findings is that the firms that actually cut their disclosures, so, in this like 15 to 17 page group, they cut their disclosures to get under this threshold, they became less likely to receive SEC comment letters. And, we've had a little bit of a tough time explaining that. The best explanation that we might have for that is that, the summaries themselves are maybe not what the SEC intended. So we hand collected a sample of 100 summaries or 100 firms that should have provided summaries. And 88 of the summaries basically just reiterate the subcaptions in the firm's risk factor disclosures. And so that does not appear to be, based on the concerns that were stated to the SEC, what people thought was going to happen before the regulation was passed. And then the other 12 firms, their summaries were difficult to find. And so those firms either did not comply with the requirement, or they were part of the meaningful cautionary language, or were somewhere else, in the 10K that we couldn't clearly locate. And so it could be that, the people who cut were less likely to receive an SEC comment letter because the people who did provide the summaries provided summaries that the SEC didn't really view as compliant, by just providing these recycled subcaptions and captions from their risk factor disclosures. So by providing sort of bad summaries, that's one explanation for why, these firms may have actually gotten sort of a benefit from cutting. So it's not a great explanation, but it's sort of difficult to describe, another reason for it as far as we can find. So if anyone has any other explanation on that, we would love to hear it. It's just sort of a strange finding. Okay. All right. So again, this was intended to improve disclosure for investors. That was the SEC's goal. And I just described how firms implemented this. So it's hard to say, as I said, that that's an improvement in disclosure, because you can literally go down the risk factor disclosure and see the subcaptions and the captions, right? So how that would be viewed as an improvement is difficult to say. All this really did for the firms that provided summaries is add yet more length to the 10K, which I don't think at this point is really anyone's goal, right? The goal was to provide, as it says, a summary that allows people to know what's important versus what's not important. So there were a couple other small changes to the risk factor disclosures, but those were pretty minor, and we did not look at those because they didn't have good identification. The SEC, again, sided with the people that said this wasn't going to increase legal risk. So that may be another reason that they haven't brought specific comment letters. Excuse me. One thing I didn't say, we have not found any comment letters specifically directed at the summary. So even though people providing the summary have gotten more comment letters overall. None of those are specific to the summary themselves. So I should have mentioned that. So the SEC sided with this viewpoint that it's not going to increase legal risk. So that may be a reason they haven't been specifically targeting the summaries. It's hard to say. Given that the summaries don't appear to be doing what the SEC intended, it does seem strange, at least to me, that they haven't targeted a couple of large firms who have these very lengthy risk factor disclosures of 30 and 40 pages and just said, you need to do more than just list your caption headings. This is not a meaningful summary, and provide some guidance about what they actually want. It would only take a couple to get firms to hopefully fall in line if that's the real goal of this regulation. Okay. So examples of the uncertainty that were out there when this was initially proposed. So Financial Executives International, who comments a lot on proposed regulations, they said the summary would not include the appropriate level of detail necessary to fully understand the risk factors and could open up companies to potential litigation. So, that was very typical of what was, being said. And so, if you've got, these 30 pages, which was not unusual and is still not that unusual, it's hard to summarize that in 2 pages meaningfully, is the opinion. The SEC's counterpoint was it won't detract from the more extensive disclosure elsewhere. That's still going to be there. They just wanted, sort of the highlights. But they did acknowledge it might create an incentive for registrants to reduce the length of their risk factor discussion to the extent that such an incentive outweighs perceived litigation risks. So they recognized exactly what we find, which is that people might try to cut to get under 15 pages. For some firms, that just isn't possible, right? So that's why we did this, limited scope. We didn't check, maybe we should, for, what the largest drop in page count was. But I doubt anyone much over 20 pages tried to cut to get under the 15. So, okay. So there is a lot of criticism. It's mostly based on perception, though, that risk factor disclosures are too generic or that they're uninformative. So prior accounting research finds that they're useful, at least to some extent. So Campbell et al. Find they're associated with firm risk. Hope et al. Find that investors respond favorably to more specific risk factors. They help analysts assess risk. Chu et al. Find that they help price credit quality. Cohen et al. Find that they're associated with future stock returns. And Lyle et al., the most recent study, find that adding or removing risk factors decrease risk uncertainty. Now, all those are, studies that find, they're useful. It doesn't mean they're as good as they can be, I think, is the point of the SEC regulation. They could be better. If you read these within an industry, they do seem pretty similar for the most part. And I think that's where all these industry and regulatory criticisms come from. And so, just because they have some level of usefulness doesn't mean they can't be improved. So you can see, hopefully, both sides of the argument here. So the SEC, felt like they could improve it. So we move on. So litigation risk is, of course, costly, or litigation is costly, and it motivates firms to provide more risk factors. So if disclosures aren't specific enough, they don't qualify the firm for the safe harbor under the PSLRA. High risk, high litigation risk firms provide more risk factor disclosures. But or I guess complementing that, longer risk factor disclosures lower litigation costs. And so this kind of, goes against what some of the SEC is arguing for, in that, you want firms to provide meaningful and firm-specific disclosures, but the more they just throw in sort of the kitchen sink, the firm feels covered and actually is covered, right? And so you go in there, you, as a firm, look at all of your competitors, and you see that they have some risk factor that you don't. Are we exposed to that? Well, we are at some level. So you put in that additional risk factor. And that's sort of what was happening, and why risk factor disclosures kept happening. If you've got the risk factor in your 10K, it's hard to say investors were not aware of that before that, once that risk factor is realized. And so that's what Kazir et al. Find, that, these longer boilerplate disclosures lower litigation costs. And even if the specific risk is not in there, it looks like the firm is doing their best to provide meaningful, cautionary language. So the firm is trying to provide all the risk information that it can. Okay, so H1, the revision, we state this in the null, will not change risk factor disclosure. For firms near the 15-page threshold, again, we just looked at 13 to 17 pages. And so you see on the right here, a regression discontinuity test. And on the left, or excuse me, on the right, we get the result. So this is the actual statistical test, not just a picture. So the t-stat here is -15, which is, obviously highly significant. The pre-rule count on the left is a t-stat of 1. So it's not, abnormal, right? So you see this changing from the pink to the purple. At the 15-page mark, there's no discontinuity pre-rule, and there's a very large discontinuity post-rule. So that one's a pretty nice result. Okay. Switching to some of the outcomes, the prior literature, notes that comment letters, even though they're less talked about than litigation itself, comment letters are costly for firms in terms of managerial distraction. You have both internal and external legal counsel. You have heightened risk of SEC enforcement. They get handed off, to the enforcement staff sometimes. And occasionally you get litigation in a related area. And then the second area here, this is the legal focus that we've talked about. Powerful general counsel affect a lot of things: financial reporting quality, tax aggressiveness, managerial forecasts, and then most importantly for us, firm risk. So there's reason to expect that a powerful general counsel is going to affect this reporting. So we've got some hypotheses here with respect to legal risk. So firms receiving comment letters unrelated to risk factor disclosures will adjust their disclosure length in response to the regulation SK revision. but firms receiving comment letters related to risk factor disclosures, in other words, firms where the SEC is already focused on that area, will not adjust their risk factor disclosure length. H3, the revision of Regulation SK will have a stronger effect for firms with powerful general counsel. So where they've got someone with a legal background and more influence within the firm, looking at those disclosures more carefully. Okay, so here we look at the page count, and we've got a variety of controls, the post period, and the test variable, and the test variable times the post. So, the controls are the determinants of risk factor disclosures from Campbell et al., and then the litigation risk controls from Kim and Skinner, 2012. We've got industry and year fixed effects that may also affect litigation risk and disclosures. And then we've got the firm years where the pre-rule risk factor disclosure length was centered around the threshold, where we've got 13 to 17 pages. That's our sort of broad test because, these risk factor disclosures tend to grow a bit over time, but this is a weaker test. And then firms with the highest incentive to shorten. So 15 to 17 pages. This is our sort of more focused, stronger test. So both are valid, but the strongest test is the 15 to 17 pages. Okay. So again, in our sort of wider test in column 1, for general legal scrutiny where we expect a result, we don't get any results in the 13 to 17 page weaker test, but we get very strong results in the page count test for 15 to 17 pages with the stronger expectation that there will be a cut. So these firms all definitely have an incentive to cut, and we find, the coefficient is almost 5 times greater. So they're cutting, about 2 pages on average, as we would expect. And so if we go to the right 2 columns, we see a falsification test. So here, just in case anyone doubts that this is, due to the risk factor regulation, we do the same thing with the management discussion and analysis section. And so we don't see anything similar. In fact, the coefficients are mildly positive, but not significant. And so the MD&A, is basically staying steady, right? So nothing really happening there. Okay. For direct legal scrutiny, these are firms that got risk factor comment letters. We can see nothing happening. So, they're already getting scrutiny on their risk factor disclosures. So they have, probably an incentive not to change things too much because, the SEC often looks at the same area after they've already examined it. And so these firms don't cut, probably because they're worried the SEC is still looking at their risk factor disclosures. They don't want to draw attention to it by changing too much other than what they responded to the SEC about in their response to that comment letter. So they're not making other changes until sort of the dust settles, no cuts. MD&A and our falsification test is actually growing for these firms. So, just a random sort of finding and pretty much standard with the 10K in general. 10Ks tend to grow over time. So, okay, powerful general counsel. The more powerful the general counsel, we actually see a mild result of a cut in the 13 to 17 page group here. But again, about a 3 times the coefficient, roughly, in the 15 to 17 page group, which is the stronger result, and the statistical significance is much higher. Nothing again in the MD&A group. So, once again, in line with our expectations. The more powerful the general counsel, the more influence that person has. They cut, they avoid the additional summary once again. Okay, just an example here. You're not going to be able to read this, but I don't like to include things people can't read normally, but we wanted to preserve the exact appearance from the 10K. So this is a cosmetically shortened disclosure. So this is the same firm. So just kind of look at the number of lines here as if you're looking at an eye chart. And then we'll flip back and forth to the same firm post. So you can see the number of lines. And then you can see there's just a lot more lines post. So you can see pre, there's, I don't know, about 12. And post, we've got, I don't know, roughly 20. And so, they have, the same group of lines, a break here with other things, and then another group of lines starting. So they've just changed, after this forward-looking statements, if you can read it, they've just cosmetically, again, changed it. They've tightened up the spacing of the bullets. And that's the only point here, that some firms do this in addition to real cuts. So you can do that. And a lot of firms, I don't know about a lot, some firms, I should say, did that as well. And so I apologize for the small print, but the only point is to see the change in appearance, not really the substance of the disclosure. So that's just, an example of cosmetic shortening. You can change the spacing, and, you can even go to like single spacing on the bullets or things like that. Okay. Word counts. So this is cosmetic versus substantive. You can see again, it's mostly substantive. So the word counts versus the cosmetic spacing. So firms with 15 to 17 pages, again, they cut about 3 times as many words. So it's not just that cosmetic spacing that we just saw. They're actually cutting the words in the risk factor disclosures by quite a bit. And we see, again, nothing being cut in the MD&A section. All right. So they go in and they're cutting sentences, words, etc., getting rid of things. This is the example, just some descriptives of what I just showed. So the people who don't cut, you can see it's basically identical as far as the risk factors. They add some new risk factors, right? Firms change risk factors over time. So before the rule change, they were adding 3.7 new risk factors and deleting 3 risk factors. After, they were adding 4.5 and deleting 4.1. So, they had some churn, but they were on average, adding, less than 1 per year. For the shrinking firms, their risk factors were, again, decreasing by about 5. So they had 43.4, and they were decreasing down to about 38. And so the new risk factors were about the same, right? So they'd add some new ones, before the rule change, and they added some new ones after the rule change. So they would have some churn, but the difference is in the deletions, right? So they would delete about, 10 risk factors after compared to, between 5 and 6 before on average. So they're cutting words and sentences in the forms of real risk factors. So as far as readability, we talked about this briefly before. The fog index and another readability index, both of these, a negative sign means more readable. We don't find anything in the full sample, but we do find, again, in this limited sample of 15 to 17 pages, the cutters, as we refer to them in the paper. The negative sign indicates a little more readability. So they become a bit more readable. So these firms that are cutting their disclosures a bit, I guess it's like when you prepare a paper to submit to a journal, you often try to hit some threshold, your paper becomes a little bit more readable. And that's, consistent with maybe superior or better, disclosure like the SEC wanted. We have a hard time thinking that's their real goal because, it's only for these firms that avoided the summary requirement. But nevertheless, we do acknowledge that in the paper. So it is what it is. But it doesn't seem like probably what the SEC was really going after. Okay. So, disclosure shrinkage and legal scrutiny. What happens to these firms? Again, what you'd kind of expect is that if you're evading the SEC's goal, you might get more legal scrutiny and you actually get less. So in the full sample, if you shrink your disclosures from that 15 to 17 pages to evade the summary, you're actually less likely to get a comment letter. And again, we thought that's kind of weird. The best explanation we had is that maybe it's because the people who actually provide the summaries don't provide very useful summaries. That's not entirely satisfying either, because the people evading the summary are also evading, an SEC requirement. So it's kind of a strange finding. But maybe it's just because they have less in the 10K, not a great explanation for that at this point. But it is what it is. So firms, what we find is, again, firms manage disclosures around this bright line threshold that's, provided at these 15 pages. We also did a test for like securities litigation. We didn't find anything there. We didn't find, like I said, any SEC enforcement actions in this area. So we say firms with high, but not the highest legal risk, are most likely to manage risk factor disclosures to avoid legal uncertainty. And then managing these disclosures does appear relatively effective for these firms. So they get fewer SEC comment letters. There appears to be no consequence. They avoid the summary requirement. They don't get any penalty. So there doesn't appear to be any downside. Investors, if anything, seem likely to be worse off for the firms that are near that regulatory threshold if you believe the risk factor disclosure is useful. fewer risk factors are provided and they're less specific. So, you know, there's fewer words, less detail. So the SEC's goal, again, it's more readable marginally, but the risk factor disclosure is shorter and there's fewer risk factors. So, you know, it's hard to tell whether, or it's hard to say, in my view, I don't want to speak for my co-authors necessarily, but I think I do. But it's hard for me to say that the SEC's goal was met here from a policy perspective. So it's very it's a strange result, I guess. So if you put all the findings together, I don't really see, you know, any real positive outcome at this point from this regulation. So we get a limited number of summaries that are just sort of rehashing, you know, the captions from the risk factor disclosures, and, you know, they're just not overly useful, it appears. A fair number of firms evaded providing the summaries. So, you know, we'll kind of leave it at that. So, no one asked questions during the presentation. Are there questions at this point that people have?
Thank you very much for your contribution, dear Professor Dain Donelson, and thank you very much for your effort. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Don?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Dane. I just had a question somewhat related to what Changyi wrote in the chat, which was a little bit explaining this reason why these firms right on the cusp here may have not received as many comment letters. And it kind of goes to the, I guess, kind of the connotation that was taken away from the fact that they, and you're using words like they evaded this threshold, and that they, it's kind of like a negative connotation for they did it. But it seems like you could also tell the story where actually the SEC could say, you know, those firms, they spent extra work to clarify, they, you know, bettered their readability score, but then also like maybe some of those things that they removed were like that list you had up, which I could read a couple, which was like levels of dividends are a concern or a
Right.
risk factor. And you're like, well, you know, that's not really telling me much.
Right.
It's very readable, but it's not really telling me much. So that was kind of like the SEC could say, okay, great. For those firms, it really made them think harder about putting this kind of like fluff in there. It's not even like it's boilerplate. It's just fluff. It's like you basically make a list of everything that investors could potentially uh, remotely complain about, and then you say, oh, that's a risk factor. It's a risk factor. We've thought about it. We've thought about it. So I thought that was a potential other explanation for this lower levels of comment letters. And it's also related to the cusp being the sort of 15 to 17 pages, that there's kind of like this trade-off. It's like, well, do you want to leave it at 17 pages and then you have to write 2 other pages which are related to this? And
Yeah.
you're like, well, that's kind of stupid. Like, why don't I just really work hard on cleaning this up? And I think your reference to, or your relation to the way that we work on academic papers to improve them and improve the readability, and like take the reader along on this ride is, from my experience at the SEC, was kind of the essence of what we were trying to get. And final point I wanted to make is just that I was kind of wondering if some of this information was discussed, particularly the data that you have on the firms that are likely to be making these changes. I know that DERA and before that, Office of Economic Analysis was really tasked with showing the impact on firms, and this seems like data that wouldn't be that hard for them to assess as they're going through the proposal stages of the rule. And I didn't know if you had seen anything on that through your research or your co-authors, but I just wanted to ask about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we haven't seen anything from them, certainly. And I meant to say avoided, not evaded. So I think I would have cut it, if I was a firm. So I don't know that it's bad, to do it. But I think it's perfectly logical for firms to do it if they have a reason. Like, certainly, I've thought a lot of the risk factors are not even risk factors, right? And some of them are so ubiquitous that they're meaningless, right? Like, everyone has a risk factor about, or everyone I've ever read has a risk factor with, like, the price of gas, right? Like, it's going to raise, the price of our product, right? And it's just like, well, how informative is that, right?
Right.
Except maybe, so,
I also saw the other one on that list, which was like cash flows from operations. And I was
right,
like,
yeah,
yeah,
they're not,
obviously, like,
yeah, obviously, like, yeah, I guess now if our CEO gets caught at a Coldplay concert, right, with having an
right,
affair,
right.
right? Like, how much can you say with some of these things? So, I mean, I don't think it's illogical. I don't necessarily think it's bad. If I gave that impression, I mean, I think I just, when you start presenting, you get into a pattern, but I think avoiding the threshold is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just, it's a thing, right? And so I think anytime you put
Yeah,
out
and
right,
I
you put
guess it
out a
was.
target and people are going to try to hit it. And I think the
Mhm.
nice thing about this is that um, it just um, gives a very clear, yeah, maybe I was too yeah, I take your point, but so we need
Yeah,
to.
and I appreciate you talking it through. I mean, and I was also just looking at the slide you have on the screen right now, which says, they're producing less specific, um, which
Yeah,
kind of has this connotation of like, oh, well, that's not good. Like, we want them to
yeah,
be specific enough.
yeah,
But I think it's the way that we measure specificity
right,
with something that is already this kind of like
yeah,
whack-a-mole type risk factor list. So I think that was kind of the thing that was my takeaway, which is that it's
right.
hard to say uh, that this is something that was kind of getting closer to the SEC's goal or getting further away from the SEC's goal with this change, with this amendment, because the way we're kind of measuring it's a little bit kind of problematic, I guess.
No, I think that's a good point. I think maybe what we need to do is take a look at, a sample of some of the risk factors that were cut and see if they were just these generic boilerplate ones that are not very helpful anyway, versus, and maybe we can compare them to other firms in the industry. Like, is it one of these factors that's there for every firm in the industry already versus it's,
Well, and I think that your information related to the high powerful general counsel,
right.
variables, and that's potentially another sort of cross-sectional analysis that could kind of help you get there.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah, no, that's good points. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your questions. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Dear Professor Dain, could you please explain the economic significance of the result?
Sorry, what was that?
Economic significance of the result.
Yeah, so I mean, depends on which result you're talking about. They cut about 2 pages on average, you know, which is kind of about what you'd expect. You know, as far as risk factors themselves, they cut about 5. You know, and we give a lot of other economic significance numbers in the paper. Those are the ones I can kind of remember off the top of my head. But, you know, it's kind of like we talked about, when you give people a goal, you know, they go for the goal. And one of the issues is that the SEC didn't define pages. And so although it seems really kind of silly to say that, it matters, right? So if you know, item 1A doesn't actually start on page 1. And so if it starts on the middle of page 5, is that a full page, right? Or how do we count that, right? And so I think a lot of firms cut maybe more than they had to, because I think a lot of them counted that as a full page. And so they just wanted to be safe and not have this come back. So like a half a page was a page, or a quarter of a page, you know, was a page. So we tried to be kind of conservative, but, you know, it was, I think firms just, you know, tried to be careful. I think we counted, you know, if it was on a page, it was a page. But the SEC just didn't define it in the regulation. And so, you know, that's why we, you know, the graph still looks pretty stark, even though there's some margin for error in that counting. But the results, you know, are pretty economically significant, but there could be even more, you know, quote unquote cutters, shrinkers, whatever you want to call them, than what we've really got. You know, depending on how risk-taking firms are as far as defining page counts and things like that. So,
Thank you. Thank you. If any other questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Dear Professor Dain, I'm wondering if it's useful to add industry fixed effect to account for sector-specific disclosure.
but industry fixed effects, I think we have. Yeah, we've got those, I think, in everything. But other questions? Anybody have?
Yes. Other questions? You're wondering if it's useful to use event studies to analyze market reaction to summary editions or disclosure cuts.
Yeah, we have not thought about doing that yet. We would have to go back and identify, you know, the dates where like the large, you know, people commented on things throughout the time. I don't know how this was viewed by the market, if people were really following it at the time. We could do that. We just haven't at this point. So, but you know, we can if we get pushed in that direction. So,
Yes. Another question is asked about enhance litigations risk proxies. Are there and proxies including real-time indicators?
Including what time indicators?
Yes.
So like year fixed effects, or we have year fixed effects. I'm not sure what else we would put in there, if that's what you're asking.
Yes.
Yeah.
What you suggest for future research in this area, the Professor Dain Donelson?
I'm not sure I caught that.
Future research. What you suggest
Oh,
for
for future research?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to do with like disclosure management, given that we've got so many papers on, earnings management. Like I said, I mean, most of the papers have been on timing. And so I think there's a lot to do with disclosure in general. Where people, firms obviously are, what their incentives are and things like that. There's got to be other settings like this where we can identify, like you said, market reactions. You know, so I don't know if this paper, where this one exactly goes from here, but I think there's a lot to do with risk factors, as Don was saying. Is it positive? Is it negative? Could the SEC use regulations like this to actually clean up? I think personally the 10Ks are out of control. And so maybe some of these things are tools to get rid of some of the length. But I haven't really thought too much about future research in this area. I'm not usually a disclosure guy. But I think it's a very interesting, setting. So there might be other things to do in this setting that we just haven't thought of yet, right? Because it's a very, specific event that there has to be other things that disclosure people can do, right? There's 2 or 3 other changes to the risk factor disclosures that people could take advantage of, I think, that we didn't do anything with. So we took, I think, the most obvious one, but there's a couple others that other creative people could, I think, do stuff with. So we discussed briefly in the paper.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Are there other questions? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor Dain Donelson, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation and excellent paper. Thank you very much, everyone joining us today, and thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today. It's have been appreciated, dear Professor Dain Donelson.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
Bye.
And you got to get some orange and blue into that presentation.
Well, I actually had black and yellow and didn't realize it too from my co-author.
No, that's right. I saw the